Growing up with no mom as a kid was my biggest insecurity.
My mom, nag-work siya abroad since nung I think 6 years old ako.
Wala naman akong parents on my side since 3 months old.
There are a lot of Filipino women who come here as caregivers. I think that is something unique in our culture.
Ang hirap na mag-alaga ka ng anak ng iba while your kids are struggling, missing you.
If I could say anything to my mom right now, I would definitely ask her if it was all worth it.
For anyone who is now joining, welcome to Carolyn Talks. This is the YouTube channel / podcast where I, your host, Carolyn, a film culture critic and journalist, speak to film creators around the world about their work, the industry, and what inspires them. And today, for National Canadian Filmmakers Day, I am joined by filmmaker Kent Donguines to talk about his film Canadian Adobo, but also how his Filipino heritage and culture inspires his work. As an artist, writer, producer, director, and just an overall, I think, human being. But thank you so much for joining me today, Ken. Yay!
Thank you so much for having me, Carolyn. I'm definitely excited to chat with you about my work, both in film and just my experience in general as a Filipino Canadian filmmaker. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for staying around for take two, because we have to do this a second time because this is my first time doing a live stream, and we had a little bit of technical difficulties at the beginning. But everything is growing pains. And speaking of growing pains, I think that is my perfect segue now to talk about Canadian Adobo. So Canadian Adobo is a documentary that you did to kind of work your way through your feelings of abandonment and loneliness and insecurities of being a young boy who was left by his mother at 6 years old in the Philippines, who came over to North America to be overseas Filipino worker. So the abbreviation is OFW, which your dad used in the film. Yeah. And it's a phenomenon, I think, not just in the Philippines, but all over, I think, across Asia and the Caribbean and also in Africa, where a lot of parents have to leave their kids usually to be cared for by an aunt, grandparent, or a step parent to move overseas to work, to send money back, and that's something that is very, I think, common in many countries that were colonized by the Europeans. So we'll talk about that. But first of all, talk about just first your feelings of insecurity coming here, because one of the things that you start talking about in the film is how you are still struggling with your identity as a grown man because of what happened to you as a child. Because your mom, when you explain how she did it, it was just like, that kind of sounds like the old stories they used to tell back in the day, where they'll say a father is going out to buy cigarettes and never comes back. But in your case, your mom told you, 6 years old, sleeping, wake you up, say, I'm going to the store to buy you a new toy, and she never comes back. Talk to me first about being so vulnerable to and in creating a film about a situation that still has such a significant impact on you, because it changed your entire perception of who you were, and I think also your culture.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd like to state that as a filmmaker, I like to tell stories that are deeply connected to me, whether I'm doing a documentary or doing a fiction work. I think there's some kind of magic that comes with the work when it's a piece of me. In this case, like, it's pretty much my upbringing. And obviously there were a lot of insecurities that have developed all throughout my childhood, even, as an adult. But it's those experiences that really allowed me to play with my perception a little bit, like the way I see it. I could have been a totally different person if I reacted to that experience in a negative way. But I chose to stand my ground, understand, and let things unfold in front of me as I experience and go through it. You know, like you said earlier, this is a story that's not only familiar in the Filipino community, but it's a story that, you know, that connects many other countries that have been colonized by, you know, by Europeans or the Western culture. And at the end of the day, you know, when experiences like this are told, especially in the most raw and authentic approach, like how we did it with Canadian Adobo, people tend to listen more. That's why we ended up making this movie.
Yeah, and for Canadian Adobo, like the impetus was a short film you made, called Kalinga, which is Cure in Tagalog, and that film is the impetus for Canadian Adobo. So that one is interesting, where you focus mainly on the OFWs, the overseas Filipino workers, but Canadian Adobo is about the children of those overseas Filipino workers. Was that an intentional choice in deciding I want to make a film about the parents first and then the children, or was that just like because Kalinga, I believe, was written by Moira Tan, correct?
No,
No, that was
I
Paco.
wrote
Paco was
Paco,
written
yeah.
by Paco was written by
Yeah,
Moira Tan.
Kalinga was still mine. The thing about, first of all, I don't believe in coincidences anymore. I think we're bound to do certain things to then trigger, you know, what's coming up next. And Kalinga and Canadian Adobo is one of those few things in my life. When I made Kalinga, the intention was to really understand what my mom had to go through when she left me when I was young through the eyes of Filipino caregivers and nannies who have come here in Vancouver. And after making that film, we did an impact campaign where we brought the film closer to the community for about 2.5 years with the help of Story Money Impact. And the most common thing that really came out of the conversations that we've had with the film is that where are the kids? Like, it would have been more interesting if we heard the side of the kids. And kind of riding that momentum led me to the development of Canadian Adobo. And Telus Originals, our funder, was just so generous in greenlighting the project in a very short amount of time as well. Because if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have been able to, you know, interview new families, interview kids, and get to know their stories. So yeah, it's those two kind of are kind of hand in hand indirectly, but still uh, standalone projects on their own right.
Right. And what was it like for you first making a story about the parents, because you have such an intimate connection, and with that alone, you know, just before talking about the just the your own personal experience as a child, but just like in having not only been a child but in watching it happen to other kids, you know, like your own sister Chris, like she went through that not only with your mom but eventually your dad, who then eventually remarried. So what was it like for you as the director, kind of like just looking on from the outside, as a child observing it, but then as a filmmaker having to present it on camera?
When I was working with the parents first, um, I thought that the most effective way, or the only way that I'm really going to be able to feel connected with them, is when they understand where I'm coming from. So a lot of the pre-interviews, a lot of the research phase of it was just really getting to know them as parents while they're getting to know me as a child of an immigrant, as a child of a caregiver or a nanny. And finding that balance without making it, you know, exploitative of their experience, and just allowing them to have the space and, you know, the attention of the camera and the people who are watching the film, is what they needed. And I saw them having that conversation, you know, like more and more, like seeing them getting more comfortable as we're having those hard conversations, really allowed me to get the story out of them. Because At first glance, you would think this is just going to be another documentary on caregivers and nannies, but it's not. It's actually a film that speaks volumes of what these caregivers and nannies have gone through in a country where they're caring for its people while neglecting the question at the end of the day, who takes care of them. I think finding that common ground really allowed us to connect more in a more personal and a more intimate way.
And I think so because and I think because that was you had that experience, it made it more when if for Canadian Adobo, I think because you included both the parents and the kids this time, it gave you the insight that you needed to realize, oh, the film can't be just about the kids. Like the parents have to be there because it does affect the parents, because the parents are watching their children going through this and feeling like they can't do anything to help, so talk about just the process of getting Canadian Adobo off the ground with regards to production, because you have Kalinga as I always say that sometimes short films are like proof of concepts, so you have like Kalinga as a proof of concept and you're like, okay, now I want to make a feature film and this is proof of concept that we know how we want to do it, we know what it's going to be about. So talk to me a bit about just the funding aspect, because before we get into the actual meat of the film, you have to talk about the process. And I always try to get filmmakers to talk about the process of making a film, especially in Canada, because the process is individual. It's like funding, like the way you go through funding, finding producers, finding the equipment, all of that kind of stuff, and then finding the guests that you want to participate on the film.
Yeah, I think for Canadian Adobo, we definitely got lucky that there was already a momentum happening with Kalinga prior to getting Canadian Adobo made. Like I was in touch with one of the executives at TELUS Originals, and one of the conversations we had was what my first feature looks like. And I said, I really have a passion when it comes to telling, caregiver stories. And I do want to make another film that have the kids in it. So writing the momentum and taking the time to develop, I've interviewed different families. I've interviewed different kids of different experiences. And it was really important for me to find stories that has that commonalities. I think one of the things I've expressed during the screening in Toronto last weekend was, like it was definitely intentional for us to find stories of different families that have so many things in common, because I wanted to stress the point that there's no such thing as team parents or team kids in this scenario, that at the end of the day, both opinions, both experiences are valid, and it's these experiences that strengthens the relationships as families. And on top of that, it was also a little bit challenging for me to also look for the counselor, because in Vancouver there's only 2 Filipino Canadian counselors. So it was, and it was really important for me to have a Filipina counselor to be mediating the conversation, because mental health is also something that's not often talked about in the Filipino culture. And just seeing someone who like Tita Sonia, who can confidently talk about it and, and be that mediator between the parents and the kids was something that was important to me.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I thought was interesting with regards to just the film concept itself is that it starts out with you, and you're included, in a counseling session, so is everyone sitting down having a group counseling session, and each person, yes, of course, introduces themselves, but they talk about what year they arrived in Canada, like what they think of being an immigrant in Canada, their own personal experiences. And what a lot of people don't understand about being an immigrant in a country like Canada is that it kind of creates this emotional disconnect within yourself, because you're coming from a country, you are, especially if you're an adult. Like I moved to Canada at the age of 26, and I came as an adult. I came as an adult who went to school in Barbados, who had friends, who had relationships, who had who worked, and built a life in Barbados, and then my sister and I, my twin sister and I, we moved here to Toronto, and it's just like it's a very surreal experience because I'm not sure for everyone else, but for me, I remember distinctly thinking, oh, it kind of felt like a vacation at first, because what you're going around the city, because it was me, my twin sister, and our dad. Our dad lived here for years prior, so he's the one who helped set up our apartment and everything. But so like the first few weeks felt almost kind of like a vacation, and like because we were getting to know the city and just taking the bus, taking the train, sometimes with them, sometimes by myself. I went to like loads of job interviews. I submitted my application at so many different places, at so many different job agencies. I had to get all of my papers, make sure my papers and everything was in order before we came here and then after. And I remember but my dad was like, you need to start working. I moved here, but because I was literally, as soon as we moved here, it felt like vacation in my head because I hadn't really adjusted to the fact that I had actually moved. But then I got a job. My first job was at a Shoppers Drug Mart. I worked as a merchandiser. But before that, I was doing interviews to be like a secretary because I had like certificates, back home. I worked as a legal secretary, I worked as a receptionist, I worked in the corporate field back home, And I had a whole bunch of other jobs too because I worked in tourism. I was a private nanny. I did domestic labor, like, cleaning homes and stuff. So I worked a whole plethora of jobs back home. But my last set of jobs was in corporate. So, and as a legal secretary, so I came here thinking that I could get a job in that field because I wanted to go to school to be to do library sciences. So I thought, with my work history, my certificates and everything, I should be able to get like a job as a secretary or receptionist, whatever.
Yeah.
It didn't work out that way.
Okay. No,
because you would go for interviews and the first thing they'd ask you, do you have Canadian experience? And it's like, what does that mean? I literally just moved here. What Canadian experience?
yeah.
And the way I got the job at the Shoppers was the lady, she asked me that question. And then I said, how can I get Canadian experience if no one hires me? But I got the job and it was around Christmas time because it was, we were training to merchandise at the store to set up a brand new store in Eaton Center. And I got my first paycheck. I saw the income tax taken out and I cried. I cried that night. And I cried every night for about 6 weeks.
Great.
I'm not even joking. Every single night, because that's when it really hit me. I live here now. I was depressed and I didn't know about it. In hindsight, I can look back and say that I'm depressed and I was homesick. But yeah, and like you and everyone in the film talk about that. I talk about just the homesickness of it, the expectations you have moving here, realizing that Canada is not what it's sold to be. Canada is not what you think it is. What we watch on the films, in the TV shows. Like Canada is a place that will break you, and it does break you to an extent. When I was here doing my high school, I had to get a high school diploma. I was doing grade 11 chemistry with biochemists. I was doing grade 11 chemistry with a physicist from Japan. I was doing grade 12 biology with a gynecologist from I believe they're from Afghanistan. I was doing grade 12 biology with a veterinarian from Mexico. And while they're all doing these high school equivalent classes in Canada, and they had all of these PhDs and and these bachelors and all of these degrees from where they came from, they realized, well, I got to start from the ground up.
Yeah.
And that breaks you. And so talk to me about just like getting to that point in the film, because while the film does talks about resolution and mental health, it just talks about just how being an immigrant breaks you. And like from the perspective of the parents have to experience that, because while they're worrying about leaving their kids, they are also experiencing this mental stress themselves, realizing their expectations aren't what it was. Like they have to move. Like one of them was a nurse. She's a registered nurse. She's a trained nurse, but she's doing domestic labor in Canada, they're looking after other people's kids while they can't look after their kids. You at a degree came and became a janitor.
Yeah, I think it speaks so much of the sacrifice that we're willing to take for the sake of the family, right? And I think it's just it's a reflection of the reality of it all, that when you move to Canada, whether you have a degree or not, and if you haven't worked in Canada, you won't really have the same opportunities as everybody else. And I've experienced that firsthand myself, like with my first job being a janitor in Canada, and just using that pretty much as a motivation for me to do better things and make better decisions in life. I think that's what it was. I acknowledged at some point, when I moved to Canada, that this is my reset button.
Mm.
At the end of the day, I moved out of the Philippines because, one, maybe the opportunities that are available are not necessarily the opportunities I was hoping for, or like or maybe I felt responsible for the things I've done and have accomplished in the Philippines, and maybe I needed that different environment, where I can continuously grow and foster myself to be the person I want to be. And like, I know that there are struggles that comes with the move, but at the end of the day, I feel that I've done what I could to get myself out of the chaos that I didn't want to be a part of. And I think that's reflected in the film as well. Like, I've like, we definitely spent a decent amount of time talking about what immigration has done to us as families and as individuals. But at the end of the day, I've gotten closer to my dream as a filmmaker here in the same country.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it, right? Like I think also there we spoke about like the hardships and the being mental toll that being an immigrant takes me. But other thing is that immigration and being an immigrant and having the experience of moving to another place does give you a very different perspective that people around you who are not immigrants can't understand. Like like I was literally just telling someone earlier today, it gives you the experience of like, there's this saying, you can't see the forest for the trees. And like being an immigrant gives you the experience of seeing the forest out from the outside, because you have the experience of living in another country, experiencing another culture, another language, and then a complete different environment and a different way of experiencing the world. And coming here to Canada, because it gives you an insight, I think, like for instance, as a filmmaker, to really get into something very deep about the emotional connection that you have to your heritage, and that the women and the kids and even your dad describe in the film, talking about like, even with all of it, like I can still feel this deep connection to my heritage and to my culture and to each other, because you have that common experience of being an immigrant. It doesn't matter what job you work, what you do, how much money you make, you still have that experience of what being an immigrant is like.
Yeah, exactly.
And talk to me about getting your dad and your sister to take because like as I said, like you have the counselor, you found a Filipino counselor, and you have the other women and the kids and their kids talking, but you got your own dad and your sister take part. But I did realize your dad wasn't in the counseling sessions.
Yeah, it was not. That's why I had to do it by myself without the counselor. Yeah. I guess it's an understatement if I don't say that this is not a hard film to make. Just the fact that I have my dad and my sister in the film made it extra harder to make this film, especially emotionally and mentally. And when it really came down to it, when I was putting the lineup of people that I wanted to include in the film, it was a no-brainer for me to have my dad and my sister in it, because I was seeing their relationship, kind of fall apart early in the time that my sister moved to Canada. And this is what the film is about. I really had to talk to them so they could sign the release forms. And
you're gonna tell everyone everything.
no, and I also told them that we're gonna be helping other people if we do it this way, because sure, like some sensitive things like this are better, like kept in private. But I also believe that the harder the experiences, the the easier we're going to be able to help other people, because not only because we're talking about the same things that they're going through, but they're seeing that we are putting in the work to mend to mend whatever is left, to get fixed.
And you said something very interesting there, and I was thinking about it as I watched the film, where like because these situations are like very hard and like it can cause so many issues within the families, there's this idea that we should keep these kind of things and play close to the vest. No, it's very personal. Keep it in the family. Other people don't know that we have these struggles. They're like, I can imagine. I'm not saying that your grandparents said it, but like like grandparents would say, other people don't need to know how you feel about your mother. They'll be like, keep that in the family, because it's all about presenting this idea of not perfection, but like everything is fine on the surface, even when other people know it's not. And that's something, and I related a lot to that, because I'm from the Caribbean, and in Barbados we have that very same culture of keeping things very private and insular and not sharing. They say nobody don't need to know your business, is what we say. But the thing is that when you don't share, not only with friends or family, but when you don't share with even strangers, other people feel as though they're struggling alone. That their experience is unique, so therefore no one will understand and that no one will care. But if you do share, like in watching this film, like all of these women and their kids came together and said, oh wait, we're not the only ones feeling like this. Everyone is feeling like this. All immigrants are feeling like this. So talk to me. I want you to talk a bit about that, just the idea of being willing to share something so personal to you in a film, and especially in a documentary, because I love documentaries for that that simple fact, because unlike a fiction film, this is real. This is happening, and it's not. The opening phrase for for SVU came, and like all the situations are made up, but the story is made up, but the situation is real, kind of thing. But this is not that. It's not made up. Is that thing? So I just want you to really focus on the importance of sharing our personal struggles with the world, because we're all not we live on this planet with other people.
I think as a filmmaker, it's my responsibility to share to the rest of the world who I am as a person. I think as a filmmaker, it's one thing for us to come up with ideas and then make movies about our ideas. I think it's another thing to it's another thing to not go too far and tell stories that I already know and then unpack that a little bit, because I think it's not only it's not gimmicky, if that makes sense. It comes from a special place, it comes from a very personal place, and if I can be vulnerable with my audiences will be vulnerable to me as well. I think that's the most important part for me as a documentary filmmaker. If I can open up a little bit more, my audiences tend to open up even more after they've watched the films I make. And it's and Canadian Adobo is one of those films that will leave you very, very meditative. Sometimes people would avoid films like this because they don't want to revisit or re-traumatize themselves. But when people watch something like this, where the filmmaker and the filmmaker's family or other families are openly talking about their experiences and vulnerable in camera, it allows people to have a deeper understanding of their experiences as well, outside of what they just watched. And the cherry on top is that it's a movie that they then won't forget, because usually we're in this day and age where content is constantly produced, whether it's short form, long form, it's features, it's serial. But at the end of the day, once we watch a movie, people just think about it as another movie that now they can forget about it because they just watched it. But a film like Canadian Adobo, that's why I took the courage and tried to find the strength to tell this the way it is to allow people to remember that they're not alone in the process, that they have gone through the same experiences as the families they've featured in, that they've spent that same time with their parents where they're questioning if their sacrifices were worth it. And I think this is not going to change. I think my next documentary that's coming out, I'm also in it. So it's kind of a pattern. I think just coming out as an emerging filmmaker, Filipino Canadian filmmaker, I find strength in my own experiences, and hopefully I get to a point where I'm no longer in front of the camera and I get to tell other people's stories too.
But I think putting yourself in the film is a very interesting perspective. That doesn't happen very often. But one of the reasons I do like but documentaries in particular, filmmakers do it put themselves into the situation. It shows that you as a filmmaker is invested in the story, not only just as a filmmaker, but as a subject, but as a person. Because you're saying like, I am willing. That you said it earlier. You're showing not only the audience, the people who will be watching the film, but the participants within the film, showing that you're willing to open yourself bare to them, to show, and it makes it easier for them to open up to you, and I think especially for a film like this, when you're talking about culture, when you're talking about heritage, because in talking about the name of the film, like adobo, and adobo is a traditional dish, because I was doing some research, because adobo is a traditional Spanish dish, but it was invented in Spain, and but it's made traditionally in Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Mexico, three colonies of Spain. And the reason I mention that is that because adobo, each dish within each country has a very different flavor, has a very different flavor profile and ingredients, because it's influenced by the traditions and cultures of those individual countries. But they do share that common history of being colonial projects of Spain, and me again being an immigrant of Barbados, which was a colony not only of Britain but also of Spain, because that's where the name Barbados comes from. Those Barbados, the bearded fig tree. Like, as a filmmaker, you're showing like, I have this common history with my subjects, and I have this common history with the people I'm expecting to bear my soul with. And I mentioned the name of the adobo, because that name just alone shows that you're thinking very intentionally about what you want with the film, but as a filmmaker, because you're showing the audience like, this is a film. Yes, it's about Canadian immigrants, but it's also about Canadian immigrants with very specific history, with a very specific culture, with a very specific background. Just talking about the naming process, because I'm always very curious about why filmmakers name their films the way they do. Because I can have my own interpretation of it, but your interpretation of it could be something completely different. You could be just like, I just like adobo.
No, but I think you got it. Canadian Adobo was the original title of the doc, and as we were making the film, we've been trying to find ways to kind of come up with a more cinematic title. But then we ended up going back to the old title, because to me, when I came up with the title, adobo as a dish, wherever you go, you're still going to be able to make it. And just like the kids and just like the parents, wherever they are, whether they're in the Philippines or in Canada, they've acclimated just like the dish adobo. And in addition to that, of course, like your read into it is also very correct. That there's definitely like a sense of paying homage to the dish being a colonizer's dish, and how they've brought that dish into our country, but also just celebrating what is available around us. And just like the kids, they moved to Canada, they acclimated, and you can still make an adobo, whether it's with pork, chicken, beef. It's the same thing.
Can you make fish though? Can there be a fish adobo? Or
Yes, it's in the film. You'll see it in the film.
I was wondering. I was thinking about it. I'm like, is there like a particular? Does it have to be like tilapia? Could it be like red snapper?
It's any fish that's available.
And talking about the inserts in the film, but something that I thought that you did in the film that I really liked is you have these little inserts, B-roll inserts in the film where like you have where one of the guests would say something very specific and you bring up an image about it. For instance, like one of the ladies, she talks about her favorite Filipino snack, which is this sweet corn popcorn snack, and you show an image of that. there's a period, there's a section in the film where they're talking about birthdays, where the mothers would usually only come home for the birthdays, and as they're talking about the years progressing, the more and more years, like each candle gets blown out eventually, and it's talking about how the cake is there to eat the cake, but the sentiment of the cake is kind of bittersweet, because it means as soon as the candle is blown out, the cake is eating, they got to go back to North America, And then there's one where the girl, where she's talking about, I believe is it Jane? She's talking about her dad having to figure out how to cook now that the mother isn't there, and he makes sardine. And the reason that made me laugh is because that exact brand of sardine is sold in Barbados. Sardine and red tomato sauce. And you show the can, and then like the plate is there. And that kind of made me very nostalgic, not only because it's a product that is sold in Barbados, but like my grandmother used to eat sardine. And when I was young, I hated canned sardine. Hated it with a passion. But as an adult, I only started to eat it probably in my 20s. We would eat it with, my mom would make it with like lime juice and mayonnaise. Just a little bit of lime juice, just a little mayonnaise. And we eat it on like a plain, we call them biscuits, but here in North America, they call them crackers. And so seeing that made me really think of home, and made me really think of my grandma who's died, but it made me think of like sitting down in her kitchen and her putting a plate of sardine in front of my sister, and I said, here, eat this, and so I like these little inserts that you do. So talk to me just about the structure of the film, because there's the inserts, but then there's these scenes where they're in like an empty living room, an empty house. And like we were talking before about the color teal and everything, but there's these black and white pictures just hung up on a line, and everyone is just going around looking at these pictures. So I thought those were really beautiful moments that you put into the film. They're simple, but they have so many layers and context to them.
Oh, thank you for catching all of them. To me, I really didn't want to overly dramatize their stories, like just the fact that we're hearing their stories with them on a sit-down interview, that should be enough for us as an audience member to get to know who our characters are in the film. But it's these inserts that we did, or these B-rolls that we did, to pay homage to what a typical Filipino household would look like in the Philippines. That's why there are moments that you see the snacks. There are moments that you see that grain of rice. That there's that scene with the sardines, the packed lunch, the empty chair. Like these are things that you will commonly see in a Filipino household with or without a parent. And just the fact that these little things have become core memories for us as kids and as parents, it's a testament that when nobody is around us, we tend to associate certain things to certain parts of our lives back in the Philippines, or whether we're or even our lives here in Vancouver. So really just simplifying the approach and keeping it meditative, like I said, allows people who get it, and allows people to then assume why we made certain decisions if they don't get it.
So okay, so for those vignettes and those inserts, they came after after the sessions would have been recorded. You have your main A-roll and all of this, and then you're going through the editing process, and you're like, we need inserts. How did you figure out what you wanted to focus on to make an insert? Because they could have said any other thing, you could have referenced any other thing they said, but you're like, what is it about these particular things that you said, this is what I want to insert and this is how I'm going to do it? Because the lighting of those scenes and the cinematography and the setup is very specific.
Like, to me, I knew off the bat that I didn't want to go crazy with the B-rolls. I knew that the story will unfold on its own. So me and my team kind of brainstormed, how are we going to be able to still make it digestible without making it too gimmicky, to put B-rolls in certain aspects of the interviews that needs some oomph, or like, if the conversation is too heavy, like how can we make it a little bit more digestible? And then we came back to that idea, like what are the things that are being mentioned that you can easily find in a Filipino household, and finding those moments, of course, Shout out to our editor, Oz, for catching all those moments, and we were able to capture the rest of the B-rolls and the inserts that we needed for those moments.
Yeah, because some of them are very poignant, like the empty chair, you know, because that's symbolic of the parent not being there. You know, there being no one to watch the kids. There is someone to watch the kids, like, because they're left with like grandparents and aunts and uncles. But the person that they want to be there, which is something you say close to the end of the film, where we like the head person that I want isn't there. My parents, you know, I have 10. Yes, I have 10 aunts and uncles watching me, but the head person, the person that I most connect my identity to, is empty. It's absent. And I thought that was really poignant because it really does show like how even me sometimes, with all I have issues with my own parents, and I have no problem saying that because I believe in being open with my guests the same way they're opening their films. And a lot of that comes with the disconnect of being and living here in Canada. You know, my mom lives in Barbados, and so my sister and I, we only see her like every few years. She'll come up here or we'll go down there. But like in that space, even when we're with her, like we don't understand each other anymore. Like that happens with your sister and your dad. And your sister, your dad is like, she's like, I'm an adult, but you haven't been there. You know, like you haven't been there as I've been growing, but you still want to control me. And like I really connected a lot to your sister in that, because I am an adult and my parents still want to dictate certain things to me. And I'm like, you don't get to do that anymore, you know?
Exactly.
And it was just point. But now I want to talk a bit now. We've talked a lot about Canadian adobo, but I want to talk about how I think Canadian adobo connects to your upcoming film, Treasure of the Rice Terraces, which is focused on the life and work of Apawang Od, who is she is now a world famous tattoo artist. You know, everyone knows her now. She was kind of like the hidden gem of the Philippines, but now everyone knows her. And I kind of saw like there's a through line in your films. You know, we talked about Paco, we talked about Kalinga, and now Canadian adobo. And like to me, it just seems like obviously after Canadian adobo, you would make a film about her. You know, because you're talking about how do you reconnect to your culture after having left the Philippines, you know, and using film as a way to reconnect to your heritage and your culture. So talk to me about that film, and just like in saying, I'm going to go and do this 5-year journey of this woman's life, and using it as a way to get in touch with your own culture and your heritage. I think using film is a very interesting way to do that.
Yeah. Thank you for asking the question. This is very fresh because we just premiered the film to the village 3 weeks ago. But yeah, Treasure of the Rice Terraces is a different beast on its own compared to Canadian adobo, Kalinga, and Paco. But there is a through line. Like there is this has been a long journey for me. Not just being in film, but also getting to know myself even more. So when I finished Canadian adobo, we were also finishing Treasure. These two productions were actually happening at the same time, but Treasure of the Rice Terraces was written back in 2019. We went and go check out the village for research in 2020, and then COVID hit. And then we came back in 2023 to cap our development, and then finished off filming in 2024, January 2024, for the rest of the film. And you're right. You know, now that I have this sense of understanding of what my background is in relation to my parents and how I was brought up, it was perfect timing for me to then dive deeper into my culture. I have a certain fascination towards tattoos. I dreamt of Apawang Od for 2 weeks straight, without even knowing who she was back then, and that alone allowed me to dig deeper into my culture and get to know things that I didn't really know as a Filipino growing up in the Philippines. And the longer I was here in Canada, the more I realized that, you know, how less of a Filipino I've become, because not only I don't sound Filipino anymore, I'm finding myself liking other things that are not Filipino over anything that's Filipino. So tackling that in a film was also very refreshing because Canadian Adobo, Kalinga, Paco, these are tearjerker films, and Treasure of the Rice Terraces is not. Like it's really a film that redefines what a Filipino identity is today, given that there's still part of our culture that remains 100% Filipino. And, and knowing that Apa Wangod is one of those, torch bearers of keeping the Filipino identity alive at 108 years old this year, is something that I was just so happy to tackle. It's Treasure of the Rice Terraces at first glance might feel that it's a film about Apo, but it's not. It's really about my quest to understanding my Filipino identity through traditional Filipino tattoos, and how that specific culture has not only shaped but has inspired, artists like me, to keep understanding and keep going back to where we come from, because that's where the most interesting stories are, and that's what's shaping us to become the Filipinos we are today.
And in making all these films right up until Treasure of the Rice Stars, what are two things that you think you could say that you've learned, not only that you learned about yourself and that you have learned about Filipino culture that you may have had misconceptions about? Because the thing is, we can have misconceptions about ourselves. There's many things about ourselves that become very true once we experience a certain situation, whether we realize how strong we are, realize how we're not as brave as we thought we are until we are faced with a particular challenge. So what's two things? One that you learned about yourself and one that you learned about Filipino culture throughout the years of making these films, ending now with Treasures of the Rice Terraces?
The first one, what I learned about myself is how Western patronizing I was. When I moved to Vancouver, specifically in Vancouver, I wasn't really sure if it would be better for me to introduce myself as a Filipino or introduce myself as Canadian at that point. Because I was living in Ottawa already, and I've spent some time in Canada, but I wasn't sure if it was going to be for my benefit if I introduced myself as a Filipino. I just didn't want to be treated as someone less than based on my experience in the Philippines as a Western patronizing country, and then debunking that, and then understanding that no, I love my culture. There's so much about my culture that I should be proud of, and it's now tattooed on my skin. So that's one thing. What I learned about the Filipino culture, the common misconception, I guess, is that there's still something that's 100% Filipino left in our country. Growing up in the Philippines and going to school there, we're always taught about how we were colonized by the Spaniards for 333 years, and then how we then got passed on to the Japanese and then to the Americans. And then we see all the commercials on our TV that's, that's always about fair skin. Go take this soap so you can have lighter skin. And just finding out that there's still cultures and traditions in the Philippines that have survived that colonization era, is something that I'm not only proud of, but also a little bit more interested in getting to know more when it comes to my culture. Now I'm excited to travel more in the Philippines, get to know, we have 7,107 islands.
Which is absurd to me.
So I have 7,107 chances to get to know the Philippines, in and out. And I'm just excited to keep doing and venturing on that, whether it's through film or not.
Yes, so many islands, and and then on each island you'll notice there'll be different dialects, because in the Caribbean there's a Caribbean chain of islands. I was explaining some on this weekend. There's the Caribbean islands. There's the chain of islands from Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, coming straight down to South America, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados sits right on the outside. I call this we're the pendant in the jewel of the Caribbean chain, right? And every island has all of these again, talking so much about similarities and heritage and everything, but each island has very distinct
Yeah.
accent. Each island has very distinct dialect. And in the Philippines, I imagine it's the same way. You know, like everyone, there's just going to be something that's just going to be slightly different in the way they speak. I mean, because I want to talk about language a little bit, because in Canadian Adobo, and also like there is a film that I watched at the Cine Film Festival, The Kingdom, where and Sunshine, where I thought was interesting. Something that really fascinates me about the Philippines in particular is you can have everyone will be speaking three different languages at the exact same time. You speak in Tagalog, Spanish, and English, you know.
Yeah.
And in Sunshine, you see the characters moving through these three languages, and in your documentary, like the women and the girls, and it flows through all of these different languages. But then there's a film that show called The Kingdom, where everyone spoke in traditional Tagalog.
Yeah.
And I want to just talk to you just about how being able to speak three different languages, I think for you as a filmmaker, gives you an adaptability, because you're able, you have to pay attention to what people are saying, you know, and as a filmmaker, you have to pay attention to what people are saying and doing and all of this. So just talk to me about how how language influences and inspires you as a filmmaker.
I always find languages fascinating. That's why when I went to university, I forgot what the class was called, but I learned 5 different dialects in the Philippines in that class. And just knowing the foundation of those dialects allowed me to pick up on context clues when listening to people, whether it's people from the north, the central, or down south. There's similarities, and by nature, also Filipinos speak dialects and languages pretty much combined. So you'll hear people speak in Tagalog, but there's 1 or 2 English words in it, or you hear me speak in my mother tongue, which is Aklanon, that sometimes is mixed with Tagalog. And I think it's one of the effects of colonization that we get to modernize our languages a little bit. Like in Manila, you call it Taglish if you're speaking Tagalog with a little bit of English, or vice versa. And it allows people to still connect, because at the end of the day, because of the nuances and the context clues that we're all familiar with, it allows us to connect with people. Especially, I love what Bong Joon-ho said when he made Parasite. If people can get over the 1-inch subtitle on your screen, you'll get introduced to the rest of cinema outside of Hollywood. And I really resonated with that, because as a Filipino myself, I've also watched movies subtitled in English when I was growing up, and vice versa. So yeah, I think the quest and the journey in understanding other languages still continues on my end. I mean, I'm learning Italian at the moment. I'm 199 days streak on Duolingo. And I think it's, at the end of the day, people will connect regardless of the language. I think our action speaks louder than words. And words just make it easy for us to pick up on what needs to be an exposition in the film.
Yeah, I love languages too. I've taken classes in French, Japanese, Mandarin, and Korean. Unfortunately, I am fluent in none of those because classes here are expensive. And I've tried learning Korean on my. I can read Hangul. I can speak a little bit of Korean, but I don't. I need immersion. I need to be able to be in those places to really pick up on them. But one of the reasons I learned them is because I watch a lot of Asian cinema, so I wanted to have some kind of foundation in understanding the films and the cultures. But one of the things I love about living in Canada and in Toronto is because we're surrounded by so many different people from so many different cultures. You're hearing so many different accents, dialects, languages, and it's fascinating. At first, your brain can't comprehend it. It's like a cacophony. Your brain is like, what am I hearing? But then you start to learn to differentiate between each language. You even can start to differentiate between some dialects, if you're around people enough. And I always, and so I have no problem watching films with subtitles. I grew up watching Asian cinema. I grew up watching some like PBS documentaries and dramas, and people are like, you speak English, why do you need to watch things? Because the language is actually completely different. Like,
Yeah.
but in Barbados, we speak our dialect, and then we speak what is called proper English. But then when you listen to like BBC and PBS productions, and all, like that English is like old English, you know, like we read Shakespeare in secondary school, you know, we had to read Jane Eyre, Jane Austen, all that stuff. So I love watching films from other countries because, as I always say, we don't live on this planet alone. We live on a planet with people who speak all these different languages, and just listening to people talk can give you an idea of who they are and their experiences. Because if you hear someone speaking Tagalog, you know, okay, yeah, they're Filipino, but then you can start to think about the history of the Philippines.
Yeah.
You know, you can start thinking about the culture, and that should make you curious. It does make me curious. And we'll begin to wrap it up with something I want to talk. I when the film Treasures of the Rice Terrace does come on, I do see I'm going to interview you again about that specifically, but I want to talk about just a little bit about the tattoos, because tattoos is a language in and of itself.
Yeah.
You know, and you, when you made Canadian Adobo, you didn't have the tattoos, but now you do. How does that change the way that you see your progression as your growth since Canadian Adobo to now? You know, because that because I thought it was something interesting where you said like, now I have something that shows my culture, and I'm like, but you are Filipino, you are your culture. And I just thought it was interesting that you kind of like needed the tattoos to add the outward symbol of that. Whereas like, I'm like, but you are Filipino, you are things. So just talk to me about that, because when you said that, it was just like, huh.
Yeah, I think at first glance, I still see myself as someone who is a product of colonization, right? So sure, I might be Filipino presenting in terms of my physical attributes, but if we go super technical with it, like I'm a mix of multicultures, both on the Spanish side and the Asian side. But also, you know, being born and raised in the Philippines, and again, like I said, coming from a Western patronizing country and then moving to a Western country, like there is that constant test of identity of, am I really Filipino? Am I Canadian now? Am I Filipino Canadian? Where do we draw the line? But now that I have tattoos that are on my sleeve, I could literally show to people, no, I'm Filipino, because you go check out other tattoo cultures, they won't have what I have on my skin. And that's one of the most important things I learned from Apo Wang Od, is when she said that tattoos are not just an art form. Tattoos are things on your body that nobody can take away from you. It's almost like tattoo is used as a storytelling tool to understand who an individual is. That's why I'm so happy about my tattoos. You know, when I started Treasure, I didn't have any tattoos, but I had to document my whole journey in making the film, and the best way to document it is with my tattoos, because every tattoo on my body doesn't only have a cultural significance, but it also defines certain core memories of my life that I will forever cherish and happily share to people when asked.
Is there's symbol of your growth, you know, like
Yeah.
you aren't who you were 5 years ago, like you weren't who you are a year ago, you
Yeah.
know, and as a filmmaker, like it shows that you're growing as a filmmaker too. You're growing
Yeah.
as someone who's learning how to use film as a medium to not only teach other people but to grow yourself personally.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important to be so confident about your identity today. I think there's always, you know, there's always this constant push and pull between understanding who you are as a person while also considering other people's perspective towards you. And what I realized and what I learned through the process is that the more confident I become, the more clear it is to me who I am as a Filipino and as a Filipino Canadian, the more I'm going to be able to influence and inspire other people to do the same.
I sometimes I like to ask this question, and I know sometimes it may seem like hasty and like thing, but do you have an idea of what your next project will be?
Yes. Cooking. It's already cooking as we speak. I'm shooting the short film in a couple of weeks. That's a proof of concept for my first feature, fiction. But it's a thriller that involves Philippine folk dance, the hardest Philippine folk dance, tinikling in it. It's like Whiplash meets Black Swan, but with Philippine folk dance. And then I'm also cooking up a political thriller that I cannot share more about it yet. Not yet.
Thrillers will be interesting because one thing about Filipino culture is that I know you guys love horror movies.
Yeah.
And like I'm like, ooh, and the traditional dance you're talking about, I don't remember the name, but that's the one where like the
The
women's
bamboo
hands
stick.
they're doing
No, the one with the bamboo sticks.
with the bamboo stick. Oh,
Yeah.
listen, that dance stresses me out.
Exactly.
I saw that dance performed live years ago, as a kid. And then recently I saw a video of this guy, he's doing it and he's blindfolded. I'm like, I
Yeah.
cannot. Just the thought of it hurts my ankles just even thinking.
Yes.
Wow.
Because
Yeah,
you just so that's what's next.
wow, like that's interesting. Yeah. I'm so excited for talking to you, Ken, and I'm so excited to I'm so glad that I met you at the film festival because when you showed me your tattoos, I was just like, yes, I have to speak to this person. I'm so glad that I did, that I got the chance to meet and to speak with you because I'm always interested in like helping people to learn more about new up and coming filmmakers and like especially filmmakers of color from
Yes.
from immigrant communities because I'm proud to say I'm an immigrant because I recognize I say as recognition of where I came from and the struggle that I survived moving here because people think immigrating is easy. Immigrating is not easy. It's expensive and it will break your soul and break your body and we survive. I always say that we survived, and I claim that.
Still surviving.
Still surviving because Canada, what is going on? But thank you so much for joining me, Ken, and thank you so much for taking the time for speaking with me today for National Canadian Film Day. And this, of course, is recording. It is recording. The light is there, and I'll post it in again on YouTube in video format and in my podcast. But I can't wait to see what you do next. I'm definitely now looking forward to watching Treasures of the Rice. Listen, I can't even express how much I'm so fascinated by Ado. I also like. Congratulations to you for doing that.
Thank you so much for having me, Carolyn.
No, thank you so much. This was a pleasure. I will let you go now and I will end the live stream. And I saw people were watching and then they were dipping in and out, so I don't know what's going on. But whoever watched, thank you for joining us and I hope you enjoyed it. And this evening at 9 p.m. Eastern, I will be doing a live tweet of the film Brother by Clement Virgo. So if anyone wants to join the live tweet, please feel free. I'll be using the hashtag CanFilmDay and Brother. So yeah.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thanks. Bye, Ken. Have a good evening.
You too.